You ready? Good morning. Good morning. We're ready to get started. First, I'd like to say welcome to Northminster Presbyterian Church. Thank you for coming today. We're going to start off by having Reverend Dr. Lawrence Willis kick us off with prayer. Reverend Willis.
Welcome. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, is it not? Won't you be my neighbor? We certainly welcome this opportunity to learn more and to share and to be a part of an emerging history that will set the tone for a legacy where people will not only remember, but people will learn and grow. Let us pray. Eternal God, we thank you for another day in your presence. Today, Heavenly Father, with gratitude on our lips and purpose in our hearts, we thank you for gathering us in this sacred space to reflect, to learn, and to continue the unfinished work of justice. Lord, as we meet to discuss civil rights and to encourage the truths revealed in the cost of the vote, we ask that you open our minds and steady our spirits. Remind us that the rights we exercise today were purchased through struggle, through sacrifice, and unshakable faith. Help us to honor the footsteps of those who marched, those who organized, those who cast ballots with trembling hands but courageous hearts. O Lord our God, give us clarity of thought, unity of purpose, and compassion for one another. Let us this day be a part of a meeting that is more than a conversation, but it is a catalyst for action. Let this book be more than a document of historical events, but make it a mirror that reveals our responsibility in this present hour, in this present day. Strengthen us to comfort and to confront hard truths. Comfort those who are struggling and encourage them to lift up their voices and to remain steadfast in the purest sense as they pursue more justice and equality in our society. Lord, guide our dialogue so that wisdom will raise, understanding will deepen, and commitment will grow. Bless every participant, Heavenly Father, every viewpoint shared, every step that we take toward justice. And when we leave this place, guide us to walk out with a renewed courage to promote the vote, to defend the vulnerable, and to stand on the side of righteousness. Lord, we thank you and we praise you. As the Bible reminds us in Micah, the 6th chapter, verse 8, that we are to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly before our God. Hear our prayer, O Lord, in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Reverend Willis. Good morning and welcome. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge Reverend Ellen Skidmore, who is in attendance from Forest Lake Presbyterian Church. She's a big friend of this church. And I am Sharon Williams, moderator of Presbyterian Women here at Northminster. I'd like to acknowledge the lady who was moderator before me, Ms. Doris Green, who was determined that we would have Mr. Cresswell Elmore and Carolyn Click here. And this happened because of her. She is unable this morning. She was under the weather some to attend, but she's watching. She's watching. She's watching. And so I want to thank her for helping us get this organized. Presbyterian women understand that Scripture asks us to be the hands and feet of Christ in the world. As such, Presbyterian women provide information about justice and peace and ministry to inform mission and community building work. Voting is community building, leading to justice. George Elmore's story is so important, and we thank the Elmore family for sharing their story with Carolyn Click so that with her book, we can share their family story. With that, I now introduce author Carolyn Click.
Thank you so much for being here. And I believe I see Mrs. Green's daughter, Wendy, in the back too. So happy to have a member of the Green family as well. Thank you, Reverend Willis, for that wonderful prayer. I'm going to borrow that phrase, unfinished business of justice, at some point in the talk, because that's what this is in reality. Of course, the Northminster Presbyterian Women and Mrs. Green made this happen, the other sponsoring organizations. And I have known Ms. Green for a good number of years. When I was a reporter, I interviewed her about her work integrating the lunch counters downtown. So she's been involved in justice issues for a long time. So I think of George Elmore's story as a South Carolina story and a Southern story, but it's also an American story. It's a story of family. Here I have today 3 members of the Elmore family. So when we think of the 1940s and his struggle, often we think, oh, that's so far in the past. But 2025 is not that far away from 1940 when you consider Cresswell Elmore is the son of George Elmore and has vivid memories of the fight for voting rights and the end of the white primary. And 2 of the grandchildren, Vanessa Elmore and Kevin Elmore, who represent, I think, what George Elmore wanted, which was full citizenship for all people, including, of course, his family. I think he would be very proud to find his grandchildren here in the pews today. For young people, I teach a class at USC, and when you bring somebody like Cresswell Elmore into the class, it really brings history alive for them. They realize, oh, this is a connection that we can make. And so the questions start flowing, and the sort of profound nature of what history means comes clear to them. Of course, South Carolina was strictly segregated during this time, but I would suggest that history of that period is right in this room. So here's a picture of the Elmore family, and if you can see, there's Cresswell as the little boy. And it was very sweet. There's his sister, Vernadine, baby sister. Of course, George Elmore, Laura Elmore, his wife, and Naomi Elmore, Cresswell's older sister, who has passed away. Vernadine and Cresswell are still living, and the littlest baby, Yolanda, had not yet been born when this picture was taken. But when you see this, 1945, we remember World War II. This was right before the voting rights struggle and the fight for the end of the white primary. So when I say this is a story about America, it's about families in America. And in a way, it is about families of the heart, which I consider the Elmores to be family of the heart now after this experience. So Cresswell remembers George Elmore rising up from his easy chair in April of 1948. That's an important date because the US Supreme Court said, we're not going to review this case. We have already decided that primaries are part of the electoral process. It had been decided in 1944 in Texas, in a US Supreme Court case in Texas. Now, keep that in mind. 1944, the US Supreme Court says you can't have a private primary, as Democrats in South Carolina were doing, because it was a one-party state. And so the primary, whoever got elected in the primary, was going to get elected in the general election. Black people could vote in the general election sporadically in South Carolina, but white Democrats at that point in time said, no, we operate our primary as a private club, and we say who gets to be here and who gets to be out. So think about that, 1944, he begins his legal challenge in 1946 because South Carolina said, well, we don't really believe in what the Supreme Court says. Vanessa Elmore was born a year after her grandfather's death. So she didn't know him, but she keeps his legacy alive, as does Kevin Elmore. And so that, again, the unfinished business of justice, they're tending to that. Thank you, Reverend Willis, for that wonderful phrase. Doris Green, I've interviewed her on many occasions, and occasionally something just brilliant comes out of her mouth that just strikes me. She said, oh, I used to go to the store that George Elmore operated on Gervais Street, a 5 and 10 cent store, and I bought candy. She came to Shandon Presbyterian Church, my church, and she said, oh, I forgot to say, I bought my little white church Sunday school gloves at George Elmore's store. Now that's a beautiful, beautiful sentiment. And that brings the whole story alive to me. When you see children going into his store, he was obviously a gregarious man, enjoyed company of the children coming from Waverly School and other schools in Columbia. But one thing that Mrs. Green also told me is there was a fear in the community. And she remembers her father coming home one day and saying that there had been a cross burned near Benedict and Allen colleges. So there was this sort of unspoken fear in the community of what the white power structure might want to do to people. Now, this little star represents Dorchester, represents the state of South Carolina, and Dorchester and Orangeburg counties, the border. George Elmore was not born in Columbia. He was born on a farm in this area of South Carolina. His mother was probably a teenager, 18, 19, and he did not know his birth father, who was white. And he was, you can tell he's much lighter skinned than his wife and children. But he had a stepfather named George Elmore, who was 25 years older than his mother, than his birth mother, and he raised him. So his stepfather had actually been born in slavery. Now, his mother was not, but so he had that connection to the Civil War. So family lore, if you ask Cresswell Elmore, he will say, people say my grandfather, my paternal grandfather was a Jewish man, but there's no really record of who he was. And George Elmore never spoke to his family about him. He also went to school in Harleyville, South Carolina, up to the 8th grade. Now, I don't know what he learned in that little school. It was segregated, it's out in the country. But I think somewhere along the line, he learned that I am a full American and I'm not going to settle for second-class citizenship, which was the watchword in the 1940s. We are not going to be second-class citizens. Now I'm going to take you down a little bit of a path before we get to the 1940s, which I'm going to try to say is the most significant decade, I think, in civil rights in South Carolina when we look at the seeds that were planted. So we all remember South Carolina was the first state to leave the Union. 1860s, big celebration in Charleston. But there was one Unionist on the street when all the balloons were going up and the fireworks, And he said, South Carolina is too small for a state and too large for an insane asylum. James Pettigrew. So he predicted, even though amid all that celebration and the war is going to be over in 2 weeks and the southern states are going to be our own people, he predicted that the South would be ruined, and he was right. South Carolina was reduced to destitute. And there were many Black and white South Carolinians who were homeless. And of course, we had all these freed people and what to do with that free population. This is a little cartoon because I love cats, and I like to include this in there. So this is a cartoon that's called The Question Settled. It was right after the war. Lincoln, Abe Lincoln, is the white cat. He's chasing the gray striped cat away from the milk dish, which you can see the seal of the United States. The gray cat, Jefferson Davis. The Confederates are gone. Behind Abe Lincoln are the contrabands, which were the former slaves. They had dashed to the U.S. Army for freedom. And so, of course, in South Carolina, you think about this, they did not want the question settled, and they weren't about to have the question settled at this point. So we get to the time we know as Reconstruction in South Carolina. The federal government said the southern states, to come back into the Union, you have to do certain things. So they said each of the states have to have a new constitution. But because so many white South Carolinians could not vote, Black people became part of the legislature. This is what they call the radical legislature in South Carolina, which was probably a title put on by the white Southern Democrats. And so they occupied positions of power, and they were the majority in writing the 1868 state constitution. If you go back and read that constitution, you'll be amazed. It mirrors the US Constitution. It called for free public schools. There were so many wonderful things in that Constitution that if we had stayed with that one, I think we would probably be a better state. The Charleston paper, the one who said the Union is dissolved, wrote daily dispatches about the 1868 Constitutional Convention. And of course, they noted that it was a majority Black delegates there. And so every day they would call it the Great Ring-Streaked and Striped Convention and say, make fun of the delegates. Oh, he was a former slave. What's he doing in South Carolina? He's a carpetbagger. And so they would definitely always seek to diminish that legislative body. So we get to 1876, and the Hamburg Massacre, which really doesn't get much attention, but this was a moment where Black and white militias clashed near Augusta, and many Black people were killed. And that was a moment where white South Carolinians had decided we are taking back our state. And Wade Hampton became the candidate for governor in the Democratic Party. Daniel Chamberlain was the incumbent Republican with a lot of Black support. But by the time of the 1876 presidential election, Southern troops, the Northern federal troops were out of the state. And that allowed Wade Hampton and his red shirts to take over the ballot boxes. Many people think that the Wade Hampton election was the most corrupt in South Carolina history because of the red shirts would ride and stuff ballot boxes. And many people remembered what went on to wrest the government from the former enslaved legislature. So Wade Hampton is here. Now, Wade Hampton, we all know he's got a big statue on the State House grounds. He kind of stayed above the fray during 1876, and it was his red shirts who did all the dirty work. So he kind of came out of it as the redeemer of South Carolina for white planter, the white planter class. And even though he would send out an olive branch to Black voters, by the time the next decade or so, it was clear that white Democrats did not want Black Republicans in their party to switch. And again, we think of, oh, the titles change, and we know that white Democrats were different. They have a different name. In the 60s. It switched, and the party switched and became sort of the opposite of what they used to be. By 1882, now remember, the Klan is also doing its deeds through South Carolina, terrorizing people. They passed a law called the 8-Box Law of 1882. That reduced the voting population from 58,000 to 14,000. That's how many Black people were taken from the rolls. And it was really a sort of an ingenious process. They would make 8 boxes for, here's you vote for senator, here's you vote for congressman, here you vote for your mayor. But you had to read the little slips of paper at each box. And remember, there were not very many literate people in South Carolina, and often the white poll managers would trick Black voters to putting their ballots in the wrong box. And once a ballot was in the wrong box, it was thrown out. This man, U.S. Senator Ben Tillman. He was governor, of course, before he became senator, and spent a lot of years in Washington. So in 1895, Governor Tillman said, we need a new state constitution because we really need to disenfranchise as many Black voters as we can disenfranchise. And you know, this is not something that's hidden. If you will go to newspaper accounts, people said this, the white people who came as delegates, yes, we're going to try to do it legally. Even though the 14th and 15th Amendments were there, we're going to do it in a way that kind of skirts that issue so we won't be challenged. So that 1895 Constitution is still in effect today. Even though it's been amended thousands of times, we still have that document as our main document. So from 1896 onward, we had basically the Jim Crow era. So there were very few people who voted in South Carolina that were Black. In 1900, now this is 5 years before George Elmore was born in 1905, Tillman, who had gone to Washington, delivered a speech that explained what was going on in South Carolina, because some of his northern colleagues said, why do you continue to have violence against Black people? This is what he said. I want the country to get the full view of the southern side of the question and the justification for anything we did. We took the government away from them in 1876. Remember Wade Hampton? We did take it. We did not disenfranchise the Negroes until 1895. Then we had a constitutional convention convened, which took the matter up calmly, deliberately, and avowedly with the purpose of disenfranchising as many of them as we could under the 14th and 15th Amendments. We of the South have never recognized the right of the Negro to govern white men, and we never will. So there you have sort of the view from South Carolina. During this time, too, we had lynchings that were prevalent in South Carolina. So these early years, I researched some of the lynchings around the time of the birth of George Elmore, and he really was bracketed by two, one before the year before his birth and one after in Dorchester County, so the area where he was. In one, this was a Charlotte account, which said another Negro was lynched in South Carolina. It's a lynching mania. And I think there were 3 in the space of 2 weeks who had been killed for really if you go back and read the accounts, it was not murder. It was the allegation of going into a house. It was just very chilling. When you read the accounts, you just can hardly believe that these mobs would form, but they did. But George Elmore had moved by this point from Dorchester County as a young man to Columbia. And here he is. He quickly found work with the Blue Ribbon Taxi Club, which was an all-black taxi group. And he had his picture taken by a fairly famous photographer in Columbia named Richard Samuel Roberts. And there's a beautiful book where this photograph is in, showing Black life in Columbia during that, somebody's got it. Yes, right there, yes. It's a great book, and I think they're actually digitizing even more glass slides from 6,000. Yes, we learned the other day. So it's going to be amazing. And when you think of the beauty of those pictures of what it represents in terms of life in Columbia, you understand that even though we had this oppressive kind of environment politically, there was a lot of vibrancy in just general life. So he and his wife married about the late 20s, and they started living in a series of houses around Columbia, renting. This is they probably were here in the sesquicentennial. Columbia celebrated 150 years in 1936, big parade, 5 miles wide parade. But interestingly, if they had been on the sidewalk to watch the parade, they would have seen beauty queens, all white, of course. They would have had Congress people, tableaus of history. And there was also a group of white-robed Klansmen on horseback as one of the entries. This was C.A. Johnson. He was superintendent of the black schools. And he wrote a chapter in the sesquicentennial history. And it was on the chapter, it was called Negroes, because of course that's what black people were spoken of at the time. And he extolled the progress of the race. But he said two things were lacking. And I think it's interesting, the juxtaposition: the plumber's license and the right to vote in the Democratic primary. So remember, this is in the 30s. This is the pent-up anxiety. Why are we not being able to vote? So here's the Elmores on Lyon Street. And there's Creswell holding his Easter basket, and Naomi. And again, family life. Things are going on. At one point, she was a cafeteria worker. He worked at a service station. He worked for a Coca-Cola company or a cola drink company. And they really lived simple lives. Remember, we're moving out of the Great Depression at this point. Played Creswell. When you ask him questions later, he might talk about some of the games they played in their homes. It was a very vibrant community. They lived in the Waverly community in Columbia, and it was a segregated community, but it had a lot of things to offer. If they rode in the bus, which I don't think his parents let him ride the bus, no. They never let them go to the movies, which I find very interesting. And maybe that's because George Elmore said, I don't want my children sitting in the balcony of the movie house. They went to Waverly School in Booker, Washington for high school. And this is a picture of teachers at the Waverly School. Miss Boyd is in the pictures. Some people have talked to me about what a great teacher she was and how she would slip in beyond the curriculum of what's going on in civil rights, which of course was really going against the law. Because most people in South Carolina, if you were a public school child, you would have listened and read the Sims History of South Carolina. Many of you remember that book and all? And it's interesting because the history as presented, Reconstruction, the chapter was headed The State's Darkest Day. So this is what school children, white and black, are supposed to learn. One of Creswell's friends said, I didn't believe any of that. You know, I would read my own history because I knew what was going on in the 40s. I think this was 54, maybe. I can look it up for you. It's in my book. Yes. Yeah, and so I had a feeling some people might recognize the faces there. And here, Creswell might talk about Valley Park, which is now Martin Luther King Park. So white children could play on the swings and the play sets, and go to the Little League games and play. But black children had to watch from the perimeter wall. They could not. But Creswell may also tell you stories of how black children would run onto the grass just to prove that they could touch the grass and come back. And run through. You cannot walk through the University of South Carolina either. So to go to Booker T, he's skirting the campus of USC. So you get arrested? Almost for walking, yes. So you ran too. And again, that is a wonderful story, but to think of what that does to a child's mind, to think, I can't play on that beautiful little merry-go-round that's at Valley Park.
It validates the point that we thought we couldn't do when we were walking to school there.
Yes. Better not touch the grass. So, yeah, and that, again, history, it's talking to us. She remembers that, so, yeah. So Main Street, of course, by this point is starting to hum. It's World War II, in the midst of World War II. If you notice, this is Main Street with all the drugstores, which would, in a decade or two, would become the site of sit-ins in the early 60s to desegregate. So, but Columbia, I think, was feeling really good. The Fort Jackson was booming. Creswell Elmore's father remembers his father ferrying soldiers back and forth to the USA clubs, only black soldiers, back and forth, and trading ration coupons. So he was always thinking about ways to get ahead. So by the 1940s, George Elmore was managing the Waverly 5 and 10 cent store. He had 2 liquor establishments. He drove the cab, and he also learned photography. So he was very entrepreneurial, and I think today we would think, wow, he is on his way up. And by the mid-40s, they had purchased a home at 907 Tree Street in what we call the Lower Waverly area. So here is, again, Creswell featured. He is a little boy walking on Main Street. And one of the things he always says is he never felt fearful walking downtown. He did notice that there were 2 water fountains and quizzed his dad about why there are 2 water fountains. But the Elmores really liked going downtown and shopping and felt like it was a wonderful place to go. Again, we might say that his lighter skin cleared the way. Creswell has some stories about that. Now, to the west of the state capitol, there were some houses like this. And it's hard to believe, but most of the state capitol was surrounded by little 1-story shotgun houses. Ward 1, which was toward the river. This is Blossom Street. USC, of course, has taken this plot of land. But in one of those houses, Creswell's mother was raised. So the Delaney's, this would be George Elmore's in-laws, lived in one of these houses. So as a young man, he probably courted her in that house. And Creswell remembers sitting on the front porch while his grandmother, his maternal grandmother, cooked for him. Yeah. They went to Union Baptist Church, which was a church. If you go to find it in downtown Columbia, of course, it's not there. It was on the Coliseum now is the site of where this church once stood. That urban renewal, that big push to the river that USC had done in the 50s and 60s was really getting rid of many of these structures. This church rebuilt on Germany Street and still very vibrant congregation. Now, I wanted to point out some of the people that were in George Elmore's circle. And one of them was Dr. Robert Mance. He was connected, of course, I think his grandfather founded Allen University. And he was a doctor, and he went before the Columbia Election Commission in 1942 and said, why are Black voters continually being purged from the rolls? Because this is the sort of trick that the Democratic Party was doing. You could register, and then, whoops, right before the election, suddenly your name disappeared off the rolls. So it turned out that there was a strange little clause in the Democratic Party rules. And a very sheepish Democratic Party official did explain this, or he was a city official. He said, well, according to our rules, you have had to have voted Democratic since 1876 to be a full voter in the Democratic Party primary. Well, of course, this huge laughter erupted, because that would have meant you had been in your 80s by this point to have voted consecutively for Wade Hampton. And Dr. Mance said, I'm going to fight in the war, and I'm not coming back to South Carolina and have a grandfather clause shoved in my face. And he did not. He stayed in South Carolina for a while, but he did not. He moved on to other places, which again is one of that sort of brain drain of great people that left. There were white people who, this is maybe a little hard to see, but Negro suffrage in primaries urged by 21 white citizens. So this was a big deal. They went before the Democratic Party. We think it's time to allow some qualified Black voters of good character. There were a lot of, different ways of phrasing it. But the Democratic Party said, well, we're in the midst of war. We don't want to do anything controversial. So they tabled that. But here are some of the people that were in that list. Fitzhugh McMaster, Hayward Gibbs, Dr. Hayward Gibbs, A.C. Flora, their high schools and schools, and Frank Hampton, who was a great nephew of Wade Hampton. But as Black people were being drafted, South Carolina parents were sending their Black sons to war, and there was this sense that why are we going to Europe and Asia and fighting for full human rights when we don't have full human rights at home? And this became the Double V campaign. So victory at home, victory abroad. And Black newspapers across the country celebrated this idea. And the Elmores got so excited about the Double V campaign that they named their third child Bernadine Varonis, VV. Which, so you see that history coming alive there. So this, by the mid 1940s, the family was pretty prosperous. And George Elmore was doing a lot of photography at home. Here's a picture of Laura Elmore, Cresswell's mother, who I can kind of picture him setting the scene for this in his house. Beautiful, the little jaunty hat, which women wore at the time. But I think he was becoming, like many people in South Carolina, very agitated about the state of Black life and how you really could not get by without facing some indignity almost on a daily basis. So I wanted to contrast that with, this is Olin Johnston. He was the governor at the time. And in 1944, now remember, we had the US Supreme Court decision. There's a lot of activity among the NAACP. How are we going to vote? What are we going to do? Or are we going to do a legal assault? He calls a special session of the General Assembly and says, we have to decide. We now have this US Supreme Court case that says the white primary has to be open to all. What are we going to do? So he calls a special session in April. And here's what he said. The Black majority who had briefly held power after the Civil War were corrupt. They leave a stench in the nostrils of South Carolina. He evoked the memory of the men who had restored the state, redeemed the state, Wade Hampton, all the greats. And then he said, I regret that this ruling by the United States Supreme Court has forced this issue upon us, but we must meet it like men. White supremacy will be maintained in our primaries. Let the chips fall where they may. So in just 6 days, the legislature removed all references to primaries from state statutes. And again said, we're a private club. We're like the Forest Lake Country Club. We get to decide who our members are. And again, remember, we have the Supreme Court decision already, but South Carolina was sort of going it alone. So we don't know if George Elmore witnessed that special session. There is one reference in history that says he was there, but I can tell you a few others who were there, and the blood started percolating among Black activists. This was John McCrae. He is editor of the Lighthouse and Informer, which was a Black newspaper that published during the 1940s. He was a firebrand, and if you read his editorials, you just can't imagine that people were not chasing him at all times. He decided, well, okay, if white Democrats are keeping us out of the primary, we're going to form our own political party. And it became the Progressive Democratic Party. And he said whites can join our party. So that was an amazing thing. And he was able to also, I think, sort of shore up timid people in the Black community who were very fearful of what would happen if we start challenging the white power structure. So he was an amazing man, sort of at the core of the 1940s fight. This was Levi Byrd. He was a plumber from Cheraw, and he is considered the founder of the sort of state NAACP. He thought that we ought to have not just individual chapters in little towns, but we come together as a conference and build on that. And so that more and more people started joining the NAACP when they realized there was more safety in numbers and the legal challenges could be much more broad. This was Reverend Hinton. I don't know if anybody has memories of him. Yes. So if you look at those years that he was president of the NAACP, 1941 to 58. So he went through teacher equalization in the 40s. Black teachers were paid less than white teachers. They had to go to court to fight for that. He was there when the Isaac Woodard case, when the blinding, when Isaac Woodard was a returning Army veteran, and he was blinded by a police chief in Batesburg, Leesburg. He was there for that. Elmore v. Rice, he was in the center of who's going to challenge the voting power structure. And of course, he was there in the desegregation battles of the late 40s and early 50s. He should be tired, but he also was an executive with an insurance company, and he also preached. So he really represented the sort of this Renaissance man. And he was kidnapped once by the KKK in Augusta when he was working there, beaten and released. And his daughter said, well, he went back to work the next day. So that was how powerful he viewed his work. And Majeska Simpkins, I think many people know her in Columbia. She was the NAACP secretary. She was a health worker. She was a newspaper investor. She invested in the Lighthouse and Informer with John McCrae, although they did fall out in the 50s. And she also considered herself a human rights activist, not just racial issues, human rights. I think if you met her today, you would probably be intimidated. She was quite, I think, a formidable force. And Harold Boulware, who I found has connections to this church yesterday, he was a member here at, so I'm always, you know, they always say in South Carolina, don't say anything bad about anybody because it's usually your cousin or, so I learned yesterday that Judge Boulware was a member of Northminster. And he, of course, was the lawyer. He was a civil rights lawyer. And he came back to Columbia and he represented George Elmore at the trial with Thurgood Marshall, who, of course, there's a wonderful new documentary about Thurgood Marshall. And one of the lines in it is, everybody said, Thurgood is coming, don't worry, he's coming. And he went to all the southern states stamping out all these terrible cases. So he was the chief lawyer for what they call the NAACP Legal and Defense Fund. And remember, he had already argued the case of Smith v. Allwright, which was the white primary case. And he said that was he did not even say the Brown decision was his most important decision. He said the Smith v. Allwright case was. So they kept up a flurry of correspondence. You know, we think of social media today. They sent telegrams to each other back and forth. What's going on? Have you got affidavits from people who are been denied the right to vote? So, you know, they riding trains back and forth. So there were lots of ways of communicating that we really think are old-fashioned, but they got the job done. And one of the things that Thurgood Marshall said is, we need people who have registered to vote and are still on the books and not been purged. So these little, this is not exactly where George Elmore registered to vote, but these are sort of what little storefronts were all dotted all over South Carolina. And you would walk into the storefront, and generally, if you were white, the book came out and you got to register. If you were black, sometimes they would say, well, it's not here today, it's over across town, but it'll be here the next day. So you had to really sort of play this game. So the NAACP decided to send out guinea pigs in 1946. And Dr. Mance, who you remember, said, I'm not coming back if I have to be forced to not be allowed to vote. Reverend Hinton and two other pastors went from place to place in Ward 9, which is in the Waverly area. And they couldn't get any traction. So George Elmore pulls up in his cab and says, can I try? Now remember, he's light-skinned. And the men recount this, that they watch him go in this storefront in their glass windows, and they see him drinking a Coca-Cola with the lady. And he's talking, and George Elmore recalls just saying, yes, ma'am, to all her questions. And she's recounting how these Negro men are trying to come into the store, and she's so flustered, and how is she going to get them away? And have you registered to vote? And he said, no, ma'am, I have not. So she gets the book out and gets all the way through until she said, oh, you forgot your address. And he wrote 907 Tree Street, and that blew up because she said, why, you are, and she used a racial slur. But for some reason, she allowed him to keep his name on the book and said, let the other men come in. So, you know, I wish she were alive today to recount that story, but she's not. So his name was on the rolls, the party rolls. So he had his general election certificate, and he went in August of 1946 to the Democratic Party primary, and they said, no, you're black, because they probably knew that he was coming to challenge that. So at that point, then he was ready to challenge the lawsuit. Now, there were several people that might have had their names put on the lawsuit. They were looking for them. This is a letter from one of Thurgood Marshall's associates, this is a letter from Boulware to one of Thurgood Marshall's associates, and he said the one who is most willing to be used is George Elmore. I would suggest that he be used. And I've often thought about that language. What does it mean to say you are the one who is to be used in the lawsuit? Reverend Hinton also said he would have put his name on the lawsuit too. So here it comes to the case, to the court case. The Elmore trial opened on June 4th, 1947. Remember, he had tried to vote in August of 46. And it was in Columbia in front of this man, Judge Wades Waring, who was a Charleston judge. You probably would not have thought of him as being very open to civil rights and the end of segregation, but he was. His father had been a Confederate soldier, and he belonged to all the fancy clubs in Charleston, but he had been remarried to a second wife who many Charlestonians thought led him astray, because she said, what is going on in South Carolina? There's this deeply segregated, unfair system. And so they started reading about what integration meant and all the other human rights stories. So it was standing room only. All the newspaper accounts said Black spectators were all around the walls. Judge Matthew Perry said he went as a student to to witness that case. So it's obviously big news. Judge Waring had already cleared the way for the equalization of teacher salaries. He had presided over the trial of the blinding of Isaac Woodard and was appalled that the police chief was acquitted. So he was beginning to understand, and he understood what Thurgood Marshall was trying to do as well. So it took 3 days. There is no record of George Elmore having taken the stand, but and he was never interviewed for the newspapers. I found that fascinating. No one did. But a lawyer for the Democratic Party, representing the state party, described him this way: Elmore does not show whether he is a Democrat, Republican, populist, or communist. He simply comes before the court and asks that he be infiltrated into the Democratic Party. So infiltrators, we're going to hear that word in the 50s and 60s, aren't we? As outsiders, people trying to get into our Southern way of life. They were labels that were going to be used really powerfully over in desegregation battles. But Marshall said, wait a minute, this isn't about infiltration. It's about the constitutional right to vote. It's pretty simple. The state had built up the primary. It's an integral part of the electoral process. So Elmore has a right to vote. The white primary was front page news that week, but when you go back through newspapers, you start to get distracted by the other headlines and what's going on. And here's the headline from that week in the Columbia Record: Posse hunts attacker. So this is a story about an attack in the Edgewood section of Columbia, and a Black man is alleged to have attacked a white woman. Now, nothing ever came of this case. They did not find the attacker. There was some concern that maybe the white woman her husband had actually attacked her ex-husband. But 500 to 1,000 white men came out to assist the sheriff in this fight, in the hunt. So you can imagine, Columbia in the 1940s, not as big as it is today, and to have these white men branching out, asking, buttonholing Black men on the street, where were you? Going into their houses. And finally, the sheriff said, I'm disbanding you. But that, to me, is a window into the world that on the other side of the paper, we were challenging the white primary. So no one was ever arrested in that attack. So a month later, on July 12th, 1947, Judge Waring delivered his decision in Elmore v. Rice. So Negroes ruled eligible July 13, 1947. So he said, come on, people, disguising this primary as a private club is sophistry, pure sophistry. He said, Black citizens are now voting in Louisiana, Texas and Georgia, I cannot see where the skies will fall if South Carolina is put in the same class as these southern states. It is time for South Carolina to rejoin the Union. So the state's white political leaders went behind closed doors and appealed the decision finally to the 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. Took the case to Baltimore. We're a private club. We're like the Forest Lake Country Club. We're like the Colonial Dames. We only allow certain people in. Again, the 3-judge panel blocked that. And then they took it to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now remember, 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court had already said primaries were part of the electoral process. So they refused to hear the to hear the case, and that meant that Negro voting in South Carolina upheld by a top court. So Elmore had won the case, and that was probably the high noon of his political life, I would say, 1948. Now here's Governor Strom Thurmond, his reaction. I predict that Americans everywhere will live to regret the principle of law which has been laid down. The result is unsound and un-American and denies to our people their constitutional right of peaceful assembly. So one of my students said, I wonder who our people are. Well, that's, yeah. But of course, that summer, he becomes the presidential candidate for the States' Rights Party because he is beginning to foment his reaction to President Truman's civil rights legislation and that whole backlash to what was coming in the South. So South Carolina Democrats made one more attempt to halt this coming wave of Black voters. They decided that they would institute an oath to everyone, Black and white, before you could vote in the Democratic Party. That oath said, I support segregation and I'm against federal equal housing laws. So of course, it's a last-ditch effort. Brown v. Baskin, but they had to go to court. Judge Waring, I think at this point, he said, I'm going to jail you people if you all do not pay attention to what I'm saying. So it was over. So here are voters in line, and I think Creswell will remember those lines. This is Ward 9. The slate of officers, of course, that they were voting for, they were all segregationists, but it was the beginning of the start. 30,000 Black voters came out that day across the state. These, of course, were some of the folks in Columbia. And here's a picture. This is actually a newspaper clipping. It's a little hard to see, but the man in the umbrella is George Elmore. So he was surveying the lines, and you can kind of imagine the joy he felt that day to witness that. But soon, this is him outside the Waverly 5 and 10 cent store. He began to feel what historians call the squeeze that were placed on people, plaintiffs in any kind of cases. Soon, Creswell remembers the Coca-Cola man comes into the store and says, I can't service your machine anymore. The bread man says, I can't give you the bread on credit. So gradually, people recall the shelves of the 5 and dime just emptied because he did not have the kind of credit that would allow him to purchase the goods. Eventually, he had to close the 5 and dime. Now, here's an interesting thing, the liquor in the little stores. Creswell, there is no record, but Creswell remembers men coming in. Now, he's a little boy, so he doesn't know who these are, and they broke the seals on the alcohol. So it was unsaleable. But there is no record of this. So by 1952, he was out of the liquor business. So remember this case at 48, although he was still working as a photographer and trying to do that. And personal catastrophes were befalling him. His wife, who we remember, a beautiful woman, suffered what people called a nervous breakdown. because at the home was being, she would receive mail at the home with pictures of lynched men. The children remember crosses burned in the neighborhood. Yolanda says, we came home from a Sunday drive and there was a cross in the front yard. So her nerves were shattered. And eventually she ended up at what they call the Colored Mental Hospital on Faro Road. Her children moved her to New York after they moved to New York, but she stayed there through maybe the 60s. Yeah. And of course, that's a heartbreaking part of the story, that he had to visit her there. Meanwhile, George Elmore had borrowed more money to keep himself afloat. But with little income, the house on Tree Street was foreclosed on. He had borrowed money from the city's black-owned bank, Victory Savings Bank. And when he couldn't meet his payments, they called in the loan. And that was a bitter pill for him to swallow, that the black-owned bank had foreclosed on him. This is believed to be the last picture taken at 907 Tree Street. And this was after Naomi's Benedict College. This is Mrs. Elmore, Naomi in her cap and gown, and two aunts, Mrs.
My father's two sisters, Esther and Inez Slager.
If you'll notice this one detail, everybody's wearing white gloves. I love that. So, but that was the last family festivity you all had at, yeah. And Naomi had decided to leave South Carolina after graduation, and she went to New York and lived with one of her aunts. Cresswell was here, still going to school, and the younger children were still going to school. But George Elmore became a bit of a nomad. He couldn't find work here, and he went to Washington to hunt work, taking Cresswell and his two younger sisters, but didn't survive there very well either, and came back to Columbia. And eventually, now here's a clipping. Interestingly enough, the state newspaper followed this, his trip to Washington, and noted that he had been the one to end the all-white primary. So Cresswell, and you all can ask questions of him. He went to New York, and then the two younger, but while he was here, he and his father slept in a van outside Saxon Homes, and the two younger kids stayed in a family home with a cousin of Laura Delaney, while he tried to find odd jobs and did things. But eventually, Cresswell Elmore went north, and the two little sisters. So again, they left really their, what I would call significant brain power, to go elsewhere and live their lives. George Elmore died in 1959. This is a condolence card sent by the Elmore children. So he never really got to see the full flowering of the civil rights movement, which I think is in a way sad. He knew that desegregation of public schools was coming, but he gave a newspaper interview in 1954. So that's 5 years before his death, 6 years after the case. And he was very optimistic about the idea of integration. And in fact, he wanted Cresswell to try to integrate USC after he graduated in 56. So that would have made the USC people's heads explode if they had gone over there, for sure. No. So he predicted that the US Supreme Court would end the segregation in public schools, and that South Carolina would adhere to that without any trouble. That's what he said. I think this is going to happen. Now, that turned out not to be the case, because in a way, the fight over desegregation of public schools almost obscured the fight over the white primary, because people's attention turned there. We had the white citizens councils. There were this constant drumbeat, our Southern way of life is ending, and how are we going to stop it? But I was always struck by what his youngest daughter, Creswell's sister, said. She was born in 49, so she was a year after the lawsuit. And I just met Mrs. Frankie Point. She and Yolanda are about the same age, is that right? Year apart. So they grew up on Tree Street. And she said, I sensed a boldness about my father. Now, she's a little girl. She senses a boldness. So we like to think of boldness as this sort of American ideal. And I think George Elmore, who was an ordinary man from very modest circumstances, was bold. I think he also might have been a bit reckless for the times, that he anticipated that he would have been more well received than he was. But I'm not sure it mattered to him. If he was in this room today, I think he probably would say, here is the reason I did what I did. He was bold enough to think of himself as fully American. And I think he did not believe he was a second-class citizen, and he did not want his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to be second-class citizens. So when we talk about that unfinished business of justice that Reverend Willis said, these folks are doing and creating that unfinished business, helping to challenge that. Because voting rights isn't just some amber, this case isn't just some piece of amber from the 1940s. It's real today. And we continue to make sure that we have full voting rights in South Carolina and in the United States. So that's what I have to tell you, and I want to have time for the Elmores to talk a little bit about, and if you all have questions, and I might start out, and I think I'll just come down here off the podium, and we can move the three Elmores here so they can, so you all come, we're gonna get mics, yes.
Green light.
Green light.
Thank you.
And to start off, and if you all have questions, just raise your hand. One of the things that we talk about when in Creswell, we feel like we know what we're going to say sometimes on this. I have a feeling I know what he's going to say, but he always sometimes surprises me. Tell what life was like for you in the 1940s, before the case and after the case, and what that meant for the family.
I'm going to surprise her again. I don't know if I need this or not, but she says I always surprise her. The life for me in the 40s, I thought I was living a pretty good life. Living next to Frankie here, who was my great neighbor, and at that time, I didn't realize any differences in terms of life because of how we lived, what my father was doing, the fact that I was able to go to the 5 and 10 cent store and ride with him in his taxi cab, taking soldiers from the base from Fort Jackson into Columbia, black soldiers primarily, and him bartering to always provide for us as a family. So when shoes and sugar and butter and things of that nature was rationed, I was living a pretty good life. And so I didn't realize it until after the trip to Washington and coming back to Columbia, having to sleep in the back of a van for my high school year before graduating was when I realized that we had, life was a little bit different, but still great. I'm very thankful and appreciative. And I often wondered, and the question that I was never able to ask my father, why? To this day, I can't figure out why, and I don't question it anymore. But I always often think of why. But I can now understand even better. The older I get, and I keep getting older every day, which is a good thing. That it was for a good reason.
Does anybody have any questions from the audience?
Yes.
How many years were y'all at 907 Tree, and what period of time was that? 19 what to what?
To the best of my recollection, we were at 907 Tree Street from I don't know when we moved from Lion Street. I was still a youngster. You can see those pictures, Easter pictures. That was on Lion Street. So I was somewhere around 6, 7 years old. And then when we left Tree Street, I had 2 years left at Booker T. Washington. So that would have been 1954, 55. Huh?
Memory serves me. August of '54 is when you all moved over.
Off of, yeah, okay, 54 timeframe. See, thank you.
I was trying to determine if I was born during that time when y'all lived there. I think I got that going.
You must have been a baby.
I didn't know that, yeah.
Mhm.
And we were 7 houses from y'all.
Correct.
Down towards your place.
Right. But Frankie was next door.
I know.
Her grandmother used to ask me to come over and eat dinner all the time.
There's a question.
Huh? That's her. And Carolyn spoke about the entertainment that took place. We as children, we were never to be seen or heard. So when adults were in the house, children were where they were supposed to be, which is not one of the things that happens today in today's environment. It's a little bit different. I won't go there. But I didn't realize it until a lot of Carolyn's research and information that we have dug up over the years, that my father was a very patriotic individual. I remember at Waverly, we used to have these little books that we had stamps in. And today I still have one of those little U.S. savings bond stamps. He used to collect material for the government, savings bonds and war material back during the time when you had war, so the medals and whatnot. So he was a very patriotic individual, although they wanted to call him a communist at some point in time. But he believed in this country and he believed in everything he did for it, and he was very supportive of it. Somebody else?
As descendants of unfinished justice, where do you see yourself today in terms of your role as it pertains to your grandfather's footsteps?
For me in particular,
That's a great question. I remember I still have a photo album that my mom and dad started, and I would see pictures of my dad in the military. And so growing up as a young boy, and by the nature of his job as a mechanic, there were two things that I was pretty certain about from a very young age. And one was I was going to be in the military, and two, I was going to be, I didn't know I was going to be a pilot. I just knew I loved aviation because I never saw a brown pilot. So it wasn't until I was introduced to a pilot that looked like me that I said, oh, I can do that. But in terms of my grandfather's legacy, I've always had the sense of service to my community and just speaking up for other people and mentoring and being just a responsible citizen and doing the right thing. And we're talking about why, and we spoke about this in Mrs. Click's class yesterday or Thursday, and the why is because of principle, because it was the right thing to do, because it was wrong not to have basic rights that were granted to us in the Constitution of the United States. And so a lot of things is just, there was a comedian that said, it's the principality. And we do it because it's the right thing to do.
Good afternoon. I'm Vanessa Elmore, and for me, with all the research and growing up in Columbia, South Carolina, and hearing the stories of my grandfather from all the neighbors and my maternal and paternal grandfather and my mother, all the great things that he did. And it wasn't until we started, some people knew my grandfather's story and some didn't. So for me, it is so important to carry on his legacy. And after all of the work that Carolyn has done with the interviews and finding all of the fact findings that she did, it's so important for me, the voting. Voting is probably the most important part that I continue to carry on his legacy, and to make sure, the first thing I did was to make sure that my children were registered. And I always told them that you can do anything in this world that you want to do. Can't never could until you try, is what is my philosophy. And it's your right and your responsibility as an American citizen to get out and express your right, and your voice. It's important. So voting, and my plan, the why for me is what he did, and I can't let that die. I want it, I'm 65 now, but I pray to God that I get to be Dad's age or older and continue to do this so everyone can know what the struggle, not just from my grandfather, but his predecessors and things of, the people that fought for all of us to have the right of freedom of speech and to vote. So I will die doing this.
Yes.
Well, speaking of voting, and I know that the board, when you voted from your address was Ward 9.
Ward 9, correct.
Which is the place where I vote. And I was thinking about the crowd that comes out to vote. Was it a large crowd when voting was first allowed?
Yeah, the area, I've had an opportunity to, Carolyn, we were looking at doing a documentary before the book came out. She asked me what I wanted, a book or documentary. And I said a book because a book will always be on the shelf and the history will be there. But anyway, the area that you saw in the photo here, the first lines, was quite remarkable. That was right on the corner of Millwood and Gervais, Millwood and Gervais. There was a motorcycle place there on the corner, which I remember, but the lines were incredible for the first time that blacks were able to vote in the primaries there. So the turnout was awesome. When the ruling came down on Dad's behalf, I remember he was talking about the chair at home. He raised up, and there was a phrase that was used by Joe Louis. "I'm glad I won," when he won a fight. And that was the first thing out of Dad's mouth was, "I'm glad I won." Yeah, so it was a tremendous turnout. That was the area, and we have a photo of my mom and dad being sworn in, because you had to be sworn in. You had to take an oath to be able to vote even after you'd been registered.
Well, the voting site for Ward 9 now is at Masonic Temple. And what I found very striking this past week was when we had a runoff election for our city council, we had a total of 53 people to show up and vote there. And I know over the years, when I grew up, I mean, we would have thousands and thousands of people.
53.
53 voted. However, I have to admit, maybe some of them voted early, so their votes were taken on Hampton Street.
Hampton Street.
But I was just disturbed by that number.
Back to the other question that someone asked, what we thought of voting. One of the first things that I preached today, have preached from very early on, is the importance of voting. It's not just voting in the national elections. Everything that happens in this country starts locally. So people need to focus more on local elections, because those are the elections that eventually make the biggest policies in this country. The folks that are there in the Senate and the House are there, but it's the local people that push the narrative, in my opinion, more than anything else. So local voting has been a very strong point in my efforts to carry on the legacy. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to say, since now I've celebrated my 97th birthday,
thing is, I knew Mr. Elmore. And we liked the ice cream.
Uh-huh. Oh, yeah.
We liked the ice cream.
Oh, they had those cones of ice cream that were
Yeah.
so good, weren't they?
Yeah, and, but I was, even at that age, I was disturbed about some of the things that were said about voting and about how you do that.
Mhm.
And we even had in school, Waverly, conversations about voting,
Mhm.
you know, and the whole thing was some of the teachers had problems with voting, that they would not have their vote counted.
Mhm.
And that was, you know, if you were in first and second grade, and you didn't understand all of that.
Right.
And we enjoyed the ice cream.
Well, one of my stories about Dad's the 5 and 10 cent store. When I was attending Waverly, I used to walk. Of course, it's right around the corner, so I could walk to the 5 and 10 cent store from elementary school. But they had this Coca-Cola used to chill the drinks by a machine where there was water circulating, cold water circulating over you remember, she's nodding. And I thought those were the neatest things in the world. I couldn't get to get out of school to go there and fill up the Coke machine and see the water run over the bottles of soda. One of my fond memories.
And they had this time that you could purchase meat, bacon, and all these things were going on.
Mm-hmm.
And you were in first grade, you don't understand all of that.
Mm-hmm.
and why it's being done. And one of the things that puzzled grade children in grade school in first and second grade was that you had to know and be on time and be respectful to your teacher
Mm-hmm.
because you're there to learn. And so there's competition in counting from 1 to 100 and saying all the ABCs. That was important.
Well, I had a lot of lessons learned through my years here in Columbia growing up. One of my lessons when I left elementary school and went to high school, as you well know, walking from where we lived in Booker T, Washington, wasn't a 1 mile walk. It was quite a walk. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, we used to walk through we had 5 Points. There was an A&P grocery store. I don't know whether they still exist anymore. But one day after school, I decided to walk through the aisle in the A&P to take the shortcut like we used to do. And I decided that my hands got sticky and it stuck to a candy bar. And I didn't know, but my dad knew about it before I got home. And I won't say anything more than that. But I never touched anything else that didn't belong to me in my life. Never got sticky fingers again.
I grew up on Manning Avenue, on the Manning and Gervais.
Having trouble hearing me. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Now.
Okay. I grew up, I'm a Woodson, corner of Gervais and Manning Avenue,
Okay.
right around the corner from Tree. And I was always so amazed and awe, not amazed.
Election time, and you see the number of people who are at that precinct location. And that fostered my conviction that is my duty today. But I want your family to know that the community
community supported the abolish efforts because up until desegregation split up the neighborhood, we supported what he has done.
Well, thank you. Well, I'm quite sure that, in fact, there was quite a bit of support, and there was some tension as well. I don't know that Carol in her research, with her writing the book, the research she and her staff did was incredible, and I can't thank her enough for founding and authoring this book for us, because it's something that we're always. But there were some thoughts, or we had said various things, that there was a lot of tension between the blacks in the community, because in the lawsuit, I remember them talking about a $5,000 award. I know he never got a 5 cents award, because a lot of people that thought there was $5,000 that Dad had gotten, and believe me, we didn't get anything, because he put everything back into his family, and we wouldn't have suffered some of the ills that we did suffer if he'd gotten an award. And black folks in the community thought that he should have shared that money because they supported him. But I can tell you that there was never a financial award, to my knowledge. And then Carol.
I think that would have been related to it in a jury trial, that there could have been some awarded money. But of course, the judge decided it on his own, not
Right.
with the jury.
Yes. Where we decided it wouldn't be a jury trial.
Right.
Excuse me, I have a question for you. As a reporter, as a white woman, in your investigations and all the things that you have uncovered, right now, it's my sense that you're probably in a room where you're preaching to the choir.
Right.
Okay. My challenge, working in white corporate America, my challenge is that seems to be the main thing that happens. We preach to the choir, but just like with the Democratic Party at that particular time, and the mindset then, and the mindset we see today, how do you as reporters see to bring out truth, to work on the mindset of what is human rights?
Great question. I've thought about that a lot, and when you're in I know that people at Northminster, a lot of folks have heard this story, and they may know it in their hearts already. When I go into a minority white group, they say, "Why didn't we know about this?" Well, I guess that is a good question. Why do you not know your history? As a reporter, when I was a reporter, I always felt like, well, let's tell the history, and maybe it gets out there. And I don't know the answer to how to really get beyond preaching to the choir, beyond just keep telling the story and keep whatever story you're telling. One of the things that it's amazing about the Elmore family is they're not really, they didn't say, what is this white woman doing telling my story? And no one ever said that to me, because they don't really see race in the way that many people see race, as a division. I've always thought, well, if we could just have more of the Elmore family move out into the world, maybe that would help just your own individual work. As Kevin said, he's an example. You get on a plane, you see Kevin in the cockpit. That's pretty impressive. He's like Tom Cruise. Is it Tom Cruise? Yeah, he's a Top Gun. Maybe somebody in the audience has a good answer for that. I don't know. It's just day by day to me. I say to my students at USC, I teach a class on voting rights. When you go to Thanksgiving dinner and somebody plops down some stereotypical phrase that is not right, don't challenge it and ruin the dinner. But you can gently say, oh, well, guess what? I learned about this. Because I say to my students, what was the cause of the Civil War? because you got to go back in time to figure out what happened in the 40s and 60s. Well, they learned it's still states' rights. I mean, they're 20 years old and they're still learning states' rights. And I said, well, let's read the Ordinance of Secession. And then they read Alexander Stevens, the cornerstone speech. What is the Confederacy going to be about? It's about slavery, the institution of slavery. Okay, so there you are handing out the Ordinance of Secession at the Thanksgiving dinner. Kind of dulls the party, I guess.
But you know, an interesting, excuse me. if I
Yeah,
may.
go.
Interesting comment, you're talking about how the media or the reporters carry the story, or should go. You'd be surprised to know the number of students that I went to school with at Booker T. Washington that did not know that I was the son of George Elmore. They never even knew about the case of George Elmore. It wasn't until 15, 25 years ago that it became, as ML's smiling.
I knew about it as a little girl growing up.
Yeah, but you grew up in a different environment.
But yeah.
That's why you knew about it. But there was those, Elvin Hodges is an attorney in California.
He's in the book.
My best classmate. He knew about it. But Harry Rutherford was our principal at Booker T. Washington. I went to school with his sons. They didn't know that I was an George Elmore's son. My point is that there were a number of people in the Black community that just never knew about the case or what, until things became difficult for them.
And there is, we know this effort to sort of sanitize history or make it a happy history. History is history, and we have to remember what it was like. It can't be, I don't think we say, well, we're a failed country, we can't get past it, but we have to move ourselves forward progressively. So when people say, oh, it's distressing to learn about slavery, well, it happened, and we have to learn what happened in the wake of slavery. That's
But
another.
it goes back to the media back then, the reporters, the newspapers.
Yes.
Dad was never interviewed by the Columbia Record, the state, not even a radio station. We didn't have TV back then.
No.
But those things just didn't happen. So it wasn't something that was going to be widely known until now that history is being told.
Yes, the idea of interviewing a Black person for a story in a predominantly white newspaper, that just didn't happen. And there was an argument at the State and Record, I think, over whether to say Mrs. in front of Black women's names. It was, that you wouldn't even give them the courtesy title. So that small things like that too. But and you're in corporate, you said you're in a mainly corporate environment. How do you find telling your story?
Well, it's one person at a time. And as you said, you also have to speak truth in those environments where the lies come up. And sometimes it is confrontation from the standpoint of being able to call out injustice when you hear injustice. And then you also still experience being retaliated against as a result of that by those individuals that are identified as being in power at that particular time. But the human side of it does not allow you to stay silent. The challenge we have, though, is we end up blending in so it's kind of like fellow employees used to be. As long as I stay below the radar, I have a job.
Right.
But at some point, it gets to be too much, and you have to respond.
And Kevin, you had a thought on that?
So I would like to submit that when things happen to other people,
most people wouldn't understand, or they say, well, that's terrible that happened, but they're protected and they never had to experience the setback or something terrible happened to their race or their people. But I would submit that what's happening now, and it's interesting that 80 some odd years later, voting is still under attack, whether you know it or not. And it's not just black and white, it's gerrymandering is the word we use today. I live in California. We just had a vote. This is the only vote on our ballot this year for this election. And what we were trying to do was in Texas, they changed the voting map. And so California came back and decided to change the map before the census so that we can gain 5 seats. Difference between Texas and California was we voted on it as the people. And so your right to vote is still important and under attack, not just for blacks, but for everybody. And so that's the word that I try to make things relatable for people to understand the plight of our people and for everyone, not just us.
I was telling my son the other day that I've heard and read a lot of people say when I was approached to get on an airplane and I see a black pilot standing at the door of the cockpit, I'm concerned, I'm worried. Well, you know what? When I see a white pilot, I'm concerned, I'm worried. Not my fault. But my first word would be, is he qualified? Was he a military pilot? Now, him having been served in the Navy, landing on ships in the sea in the middle of the ocean, I would say, well, gosh, I'd really like to fly with him because I think he can find a ship in the middle of the ocean. The landing strip on the carrier is not quite as much as it is on the land. Thank you, Kevin.
I'm Mary, I go to church with Carolyn, and I just had a comment on one of your slides, Carolyn, because it just struck me so strongly. It was the one with 500 men gather to chase down a suspect. And I immediately flashed to all those SUVs in Charlotte.
Yes.
Zooming in to round up undocumented folks. And I was just like, we're not gaining ground sometimes.
Well, I live in Charlotte, so I lived through that last week. And it was very disturbing for me to actually, you hear it, you watch it on the news, but to go out into the city and see they're people. They're in Charlotte making an honest living, working every day. When you have not just the Mexicans or whatever, every nationality that's in Charlotte, from Indians or whatever, I don't care who they are humans. And to be hunted down that way, these people are working to provide for their families like my grandfather did. So it was very disturbing to me. And I didn't realize it was going to have that big of effect on me until I actually saw it. And to go into the communities where most of them lived and see all of the businesses shut down and they can't provide for their families. And they are making honest livings. They're not out there getting a handout. They're not out there taking from anybody. They're not killing anyone, making an honest living. We had, for the first 3 days of school in Mecklenburg County, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, there was a total of 76,000 absences. 76,000 for those 3 days because the children were afraid to go to school. And that is it's terrible. So.
Voting is important.
Yes.
Voting is important. Locally, nationally, everything, anywhere and everywhere. Anywhere you have a chance to vote for something, vote.
School boards, yes.
School boards.
I want to thank all of you for being able to support Carolyn. She's She's a member of the family now.
Since 2003.
Um,
Thank him too for letting her do this.
I wanted to bring up something when you talked about states' rights. So I grew up in New York State, and I never heard state rights till I moved to South Carolina, where people say like state, and I was like, the best answer for that is to say states' rights for what? Because it makes people sit and think like, well, what were we fighting for, or against? And I never understood that or until I moved down here and heard people say that as their response for the Civil War. The other thing I wanted to bring up is I'm involved in helping to get people registered to vote, mostly in the upstate. And I am truly amazed. Like when I was brought up, I was always taught how important it was to vote, make sure your opinion is heard and all that. How many people that aren't registered to vote, and when you try to get them to register to vote, they'll say, oh, it doesn't matter anyways. And it's kind of like, and we always say the same thing is like, and I get it, because like sometimes living in South Carolina, you feel like, oh, the state's going to go this way anyways, and it doesn't matter. But it really does matter in your local elections. And I live currently in Lawrence County, and some of our races are decided by like 5, 6, 10 votes for like the local city council, county council, those types of races. So you can make a huge difference in those races. And sometimes, on the national level, when you're voting in the state, maybe it won't always work out, but sometimes in your county, it can work out. So, just a thought on that.
There's a gentleman on Friday on CBS that talks about various things. There was a young lad running for a city council position in, I have CRS, I can't remember. But anyway, this young lad with his professor or teacher, that was his teacher of affairs, political affairs. And he beat his teacher out for the position because his teacher had a position appointed him by 5 votes. And his teacher said, so glad that he won. He was his biggest advocate, although he was his opponent. And the teacher pointed the fact that point out is 5 votes made a difference between that race. And that happens a lot locally, like you were saying. Nationally, it becomes a little bit bigger of a challenge, but locally, it really stands out strongly.
Are there any more questions?
Well, I wanted to make a comment, and you kind of get it already, and you also about voting. We've done voter registration at my church for years, and before the pandemic, the crowds were large in church. We were out there every Sunday doing registration. And the most interesting thing that I was struck by was what you said, a lady in particular, but I heard it from so many other persons. They said, oh, I only voted in the presidential election. And I said, yeah, but it's the city and the county elections that impact our lives more than anything. I couldn't believe the number of people who said they only voted in the national elections.
There are large numbers.
I was large numbers. But I wanted to follow. Y'all grew up here in Columbia, South Carolina?
I
You
did.
did, okay.
He's my brother, but we grew up in 2 separate states.
Oh, I'm New York, he's in New York.
He's a New Yorker.
I did go here as a freshman in 1980. I went to the University of South Carolina. And again, not even knowing the history. Just because nobody knew about it. And so, unfortunately, I actually ended up transferring to Auburn.
So how did that history impact your growing up here in South Carolina is what I want to know.
Well, I went through the desegregation here. So I went to an all-black elementary school, started out at Wardlaw, down on, what's that, Elmwood?
Elmwood.
Yeah, and so when the desegregation started, and we actually lived in a neighborhood where a white elementary school was. We were only about a mile away from the elementary school, but we were bused downtown to Wardlaw. So going through the desegregation and moving into our neighborhood where we had to walk a mile to go to school because we could not be bused. And literally we lived about a quarter mile from where the white neighborhood started. So we saw the kids sometimes with going out in our cars, going to the store, having to pass their streets, but we were not allowed to intertwine with them. So I think Carolyn told my oldest brother, who is now just passed away a few months ago, Carolyn posed a question to him and said, well, did you ever talk about your grandfather at school or tell the story? He told Carolyn no, because nobody would have never believed it. So that, that our grandfather supported this and fought for us to have the right to vote. And so, but we didn't talk about it. And it was an untold story until we got older. And especially once Carolyn started interviewing us, man, I was ready to spread the gospel everywhere. It was just like going out with my Bible and letting you know that this is the good news and we need to. So, yeah, it was different for us. But for me, going through the desegregation, because I was of lighter skin, the impact wasn't so hard on me. However, I did have two siblings who were of darker skin, and they had a harder time. So it just goes to show. But after a while, that subsided, and we just all, because we didn't know anything about color. We just knew people.
Well, look up, there's three of us right here, right now, that live, how many blocks from Freedom High School?
Yeah.
Well, it wasn't even a mile, if it was a mile. Well, we had to walk 3 or 4 miles to hit the high, walk, and then a bus.
And all kind of weather.
All kind of, perfect, isn't
So it sounds to me like we have some unfinished business for justice.
Yeah,
Oh, right.
The young folks. I do voter registration with young youth and young adults. So, Mr. Elmwood, what is one thing that you would suggest that we would be able to get young people to understand the importance of going out to voting and why?
That's an excellent question, and I really don't have an answer. The only thing I can, I've tried to express to those that I have talked to and encouraged to register to vote, what it means for them, what it means for their future. But it's hard to get to today's generation. It's hard to, unless you can get it on AI, or I don't know how we do that. We have lost the family ties that we used to have, where we could sit down and talk to our young youth. But all I say is that we just got to continue to preach and show them and teach them the importance of it. But I can tell you, a large percentage of them have no idea or no clue, none, of what the importance of the act to exercise your right to vote, period. And I really don't have a good answer for that question. Excellent question. But if we could solve that, we could solve the world's problems.
I think you just have to make it example. You have to go out in the community, into the community and find an example of how a local legislator or government individual made an impact or difference and make it relatable. That's what I would tell my youth is, you know, you couldn't have, I don't know, you couldn't go in this store and buy this without a tax that was placed on this item if it wasn't for local legislation that put that tax on that item. You know, you gotta find something in the community that you can make it relatable to them.
Okay, we're going to have one last question and then let Carolyn wrap it up.
Well, mine is more of a suggestion. To have a more informed population in the United States, I think they need to add civics starting in kindergarten through college.
Enough said, that's what we need to do. All right, you want to go ahead?
Thank you all so much for coming. I wanted to show one last slide if you all want to take a field trip. This is a monument to George Elmore in Randolph Cemetery, which is next door to Elmwood Cemetery. It is a monument put up actually in 1981, so his story was told at that point and then kind of got lost again. And it says, "Sacred to the memory of George Elmore, who through unmatched courage, perseverance, and personal sacrifice brought the legal action by which Black people may participate in South Carolina Democratic Party primary elections." This, Elmore v. Rice, 1947.
It's right at the entrance, right backside.
Right at the entrance, and there are lots of graves of Reconstruction era lawmakers who are buried there too, so it's very, very wonderful historically. Reverend Willis, I think you're probably going to have the last word for us, but I think we end up with, we got to go work on that unfinished business.
I'm scared about the last word. But to the family, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
There was something I was reminded about last evening, my wife shared with me, and that is heroes never tell their stories. And that's one of the issues, or one of the opportunities, I won't call it an issue, it's one of the opportunities that we have. One of the other things that I recognize is that there is a trilogy that has to be dealt with altogether. The first is education. The second is economics. And the third is voting. Your dad embodied all three of those. Because if it weren't for the economics, you wouldn't have had the ice cream to go get. I mean, let's be very honest with you, because your dad was, involved with the transportation industry, the penny candy. I remember that. I read it in a history book. But also about voting. And so the takeaway I wish to share with you is that trilogy. Economics, because economics allows the community to just come together. And you've heard the expression, dollar goes in our community just once. Someone else's community 5, 6, 7 times. But we need the education to teach people the importance of that. And to teach people about being free to just speak truth to power. And the other is to vote. So with that being said, may I pray. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who has brought us thus far on our way, thou who has by thy might led us into this fight that we have, and keep us forever in thy hands, we pray. Lord, we thank you for information, for opportunity, but also for the boldness to step up and to do what you call us to do, to be a country, a people who care about each other, but also follow your word. Now, Lord, as we leave this place, never straying far from your word, bless us to be a blessing to others. In Jesus' name, amen.